The health of the ocean off the Northern California coast is in big trouble. Biologists have seen a massive die-off of the kelp forests that are essential to a healthy ecosystem.
In 1938, marine biologists actually discovered 50 sea otters floating in California's coastal waters. Animals that everyone believed had been extinct for nearly 30 years. Commercial fishermen called them destructive intruders. The abalone industry warned they would destroy lucrative fishing grounds. Marine biologists dismissed the idea that such a tiny population could ever recover. Coastal communities mocked the notion that these extinct animals could somehow restore dead underwater forests. For decades, critics pointed to the impossibility of bringing back ecosystems that had been barren for generations. But behind the scenes, something extraordinary was taking shape. Quietly, patiently, and relentlessly. And now, nearly 90 years later, those same critics were shocked. Because what happened next stunned marine biologists around the world.
90% of the otters either left the area or died.
To understand how 89 sea otters transformed California's underwater landscape, we need to go back to June 20th, 1938. People traveling on California's newly built Highway 1 saw something astonishing far below their vantage point at the edge of the rugged Big Sur cliffs. Tossed on rough waters was a cluster of buoyant dark forms. Life magazine published a photo of what it called one of the rarest sights on Earth, a large raft of sea otters near Bixby Bridge, south of Monterey. The headline proclaimed, "The extinct sea otter swims back to life. Welcome to Forgotten Lands, where we uncover the impossible transformations that changed everything." The story of why California's kelp forests became dead underwater graveyards begins with one of the most devastating marine massacres in history. For thousands of years, sea otters had been the gardeners of the Pacific coast, maintaining underwater forests that stretched from Japan to Baja California. An estimated 150,000 to 300,000 sea otters once floated in massive rafts along the California coastline, their dense fur coats making them the most valuable marine mammals in the world. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, Russian, American, and European hunters launched a systematic extermination campaign. Sea otter pelts were selling for more than $1,500 each, equivalent to $44,000 in today's money. The animals were easy targets, spending their lives in shallow coastal waters where they could reach the bottom for food. By 1911, most Californians thought sea otters were completely extinct. What they didn't realize was that without these furry marine mammals, the entire underwater ecosystem was collapsing. Sea urchins, no longer controlled by their primary predator, began devouring kelp forests at an unprecedented rate. Massive underwater forests that had thrived for millennia became barren urchin deserts, rocky wastelands where nothing could grow. The few marine biologists studying these waters in the early 1900s were witnessing an ecological catastrophe in slow motion. Kelp forests that once supported hundreds of species were disappearing. Fish populations crashed. The entire marine food web was unraveling, but most people didn't make the connection between the missing sea otters and the dying ocean. When that small population of 50 survivors was discovered near Bixby Cove in 1938, the reaction from coastal industries was swift and hostile. Commercial abalone fishermen had built their entire business model around the abundance of shellfish that had exploded in the absence of sea otters. For generations, abalone could be found exposed on rocks instead of hidden in crevices, sometimes piled several animals deep. The abalone industry saw these returning sea otters as destroyers of the ocean's bounty, intruders threatening a lucrative fishery that had flourished after World War II. Fishermen argued that the waters belonged to human enterprise now, not to some extinct species that had no place in the modern economy. Even marine biologists were skeptical. The population was so small and precarious that most experts believed it would never recover. The animals faced constant threats from oil spills, fishing nets, and coastal development. Many scientists thought it was already too late, that 50 animals couldn't possibly restore ecosystems that had been barren for decades. But California declared the sea otter a fully protected mammal in 1913, making it a high misdemeanor to kill or possess them. This legal protection, combined with the animal's remarkable adaptability, gave the tiny population a fighting chance. If you're fascinated by this story of marine ecosystem resurrection, comment otters below, and let me know what you think about bringing extinct species back from the brink. The early decades of recovery were anything but guaranteed. The 50 surviving sea otters had to relearn how to thrive in waters that had been transformed by their absence. They faced new challenges: oil spills, boat strikes, fishing gear entanglement, and pollution that hadn't existed during their evolutionary history. But something remarkable began to happen in the 1960s. The sea otters started expanding their range north and south of Bixby Cove, reaching the waters of Gorda and San Simeon. As they moved into new territories, marine biologists began noticing changes that defied explanation. In areas where sea otters had returned, the barren, rocky seafloor was suddenly sprouting with life. Kelp forests that had been dead for decades were beginning to regenerate. Fish species that hadn't been seen in generations were returning. The transformation was so dramatic that scientists initially couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The breakthrough came in the 1970s when researchers finally understood the mechanism behind this underwater miracle. Sea otters weren't just eating sea urchins, they were completely changing sea urchin behavior. Instead of roving about and attacking the holdfasts that anchor living kelp to the rocky ocean floor, fearful sea urchins adopted a sit-and-wait strategy, hiding in deep crevices and eating only pieces of kelp that broke off and drifted down. This behavioral change created a cascade effect throughout the entire ecosystem. Kelp forests could establish and grow without being constantly destroyed. The kelp provided habitat for hundreds of other species: fish, invertebrates, marine mammals, and seabirds. What had been underwater deserts became thriving marine metropolises. By 1974, scientists recognized sea otters as a keystone species, an animal whose impact on the ecosystem is disproportionately large compared to its numbers. This was revolutionary thinking in marine biology, and it initiated an extensive body of research on sea otters' indirect effects. The Monterey Bay Aquarium launched its sea otter program in 1984, pioneering techniques for rescuing, rehabilitating, and releasing stranded sea otter pups. They developed the world's first sea otter surrogacy program, pairing orphaned pups with adult female sea otters who taught them the skills needed to survive in the wild. The results were extraordinary. Between 2002 and 2016, surrogate-reared animals and their offspring accounted for 55% of the otter population growth in Elkhorn Slough. The aquarium has counted 43 pups born in the wild to surrogate-reared otters since 2008, proving that human intervention could successfully boost wild populations. As the sea otter population grew, so did the scientific discoveries. Researchers found that sea otters had beneficial effects not just on kelp forests, but on seagrass meadows, increasing both their abundance and genetic diversity. The animals were creating healthier, more resilient marine ecosystems than anyone had imagined possible. If this incredible story of ecosystem restoration is inspiring you, hit that like button and subscribe to Forgotten Lands for more stories of impossible transformations that changed the world. The real vindication came in 2024 when researchers published a comprehensive study in PLOS Climate, documenting the sea otter's impact over the past century. The findings shocked the marine biology community. Lead author Terry Nicholson, senior research biologist with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Sea Otter Program, announced, "Our study showed that kelp forests are more extensive and resilient to climate change, where sea otters have reoccupied the California coastline during the last century." The study revealed that sea otters had nearly compensated for kelp losses elsewhere in the state. Where sea otters were present, kelp forests were thriving. Where they were absent, kelp forests had declined dramatically. The 89 sea otters that had been released through various reintroduction programs weren't just surviving. They were orchestrating one of the most successful marine ecosystem restorations in history. The transformation extended far beyond the kelp forests themselves. Sea Otter Program Manager Jessica Fuji described the results as unexpected and exciting, noting that sea otters had become vital habitat gardeners, helping to revive and protect entire marine ecosystems by serving as a keystone species. The economic implications were staggering. Research in British Columbia showed that the economic benefits of sea otter restoration, stemming from finfish increases, carbon sequestration, and ecotourism, outweighed the costs by about sevenfold. The kelp forests that sea otters protected were capturing massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, providing climate benefits worth millions of dollars annually. Tourism operators began offering sea otter viewing expeditions, bringing visitors from around the world to witness the restoration in action. The destructive intruders that fishermen had once feared were now driving a thriving ecotourism industry that benefited coastal communities. Perhaps most remarkably, the sea otters were helping other endangered species recover. Black abalone, listed as endangered in 2009, showed their highest densities in areas with the highest densities of sea otters. The kelp forests protected by sea otters provided the drift kelp that abalone needed to survive. By 2024, the California sea otter population had grown to more than 3,000 animals, inhabiting a stretch of the central coast from Half Moon Bay to Point Conception. Experts estimate that California can support an otter population 5 or 6 times larger, suggesting that the restoration is far from complete. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service released a congressionally mandated study concluding that sea otter reintroduction along the U.S. West Coast is not only feasible but would benefit species recovery, coastal ecosystem health, and coastal communities. The study found that returning sea otters to areas they inhabited before the fur trade could restore marine ecosystems across the entire Pacific coast. The dead kelp forests that critics said could never recover were now among the most biodiverse marine ecosystems in the world. The extinct species that everyone had written off was now recognized as essential to ocean health. The 89 sea otters that seemed like such a small number had triggered an ecological renaissance that transformed hundreds of thousands of acres of underwater habitat. The story of California's sea otter recovery proves that even the most devastated ecosystems can be brought back from the brink when we give nature a second chance. Those 50 survivors discovered in 1938 didn't just represent the return of a species, they represented the return of hope for marine conservation. Today, as you watch sea otters floating peacefully in kelp forests that stretch as far as the eye can see, it's hard to imagine that anyone ever thought this ecosystem was dead forever. But sometimes the most important transformations happen not despite the skepticism and opposition, but because someone was willing to prove that extinction doesn't have to be permanent. The dead kelp forests are alive again. The extinct sea otters are thriving, and the marine biologists who once doubted that such a small population could make a difference are now witnessing one of the greatest ecosystem restoration success stories in the history of marine conservation.